80,000 New Yorkers are calling for a new 9/11 investigation.
Why didn't our fighter pilots intercept the planes?
Why was my uncle's crime scene tampered with?
Why did the military lie to the 9/11 Commission?
NYC Can, a coalition of victims' relatives, survivors, and rescue workers, is fighting to make the new investigation a ballot box issue during New York's mayoral election in November. At a recent march, one of the loudest calls for action came from actor Daniel Sunjata.
Exposing 9/11 as an inside job pulls the plug on their whole macabre show of horrors, both at home and abroad.
The Rescue Me actor doesn't mince his words and tells RT his fight for answers remains unyielding.
Why do you support another independent investigation into the September 11th attacks?
Well, there are just so many things, so many questions that have not been answered, very disturbing questions, especially when you look at them from a contextual standpoint. I can point out one thing in particular, the 9/11 Commission. Not one word in the 9/11 Commission report about the collapse of Building 7. As a matter of fact, during court proceedings dealing with the NYC Can petition, I believe the judge who is presiding over the matter, his name is Judge Lerner, when Building 7 was brought up in the courtroom, he said, "Building what?" He didn't even know what Building 7 was or how it related to 9/11. I'm not sure if he knew that it collapsed that day. Now, you know, any report or investigation that purports to be a full accounting of the events surrounding the day and on the day of 9/11 should clearly have addressed at least a couple paragraphs to the collapse of Building 7. But there was no mention of it whatsoever, and that's just one particular item. I mean, 70% of the questions proposed by the victims' family members during the 9/11 Commission were completely ignored. So that fact alone, I think, begs for a real investigation into the matter. You also have 60% of the commission members at this point who have said something to the effect that the investigation was thwarted, that their attempts to investigate were blocked, that they were lied to by the government and by the CIA. They used every word except the word cover-up, basically, and one or two of them may have even used that word as well. So when you have all of these people dissenting from the validity of the 9/11 Commission report, even 60% of its own members, the people who sat on the commission, I mean, what else can you do but reinvestigate, or maybe investigate properly for the first time?
What questions do you specifically want answered?
I would like to see someone address the peer-reviewed scientific work done by Dr. Stephen Jones and Danish scientist Niels Harrit on their findings of thermitic residue found in separate dust samples collected from Ground Zero. That's a big question. That's a recent development, but it raises very disturbing questions. If they're finding unexploded nanothermite in dust samples collected from Ground Zero, and if in the NIST report they admit that the steel collected from Ground Zero was never tested for explosive residues, then, and as well, the NIST report also, or the FEMA report, denies the occurrence of blast events happening inside Building 7, for instance, at all. I would like to see the theory of controlled demolition as it applies to the collapse of Towers 1, 2, and 7, given a fair and honest assessment by credible experts from both sides of the fence, but it would be great to have it done within the context of a subpoena-powered investigation where the public could be confident in the answers garnered from such an investigation.
The city says that the focus of this referendum is not a proper subject to be placed before the voters under applicable law.
Well, 80,000 New Yorkers seem to think that it is an appropriate subject for us to vote upon, and since we are the ones asking to be able to vote on it, who are they to tell us that it is not appropriate for us to, to have that choice or that option? That's an argument that makes absolutely no sense.
I've also heard you say that if there was a new investigation, the jig would be up. Mm-hmm. It seems to me like you have your own story or your own understanding of what happened.
I think that I do. I mean, clearly I'm not a structural or an architect, a structural engineer or an expert in physics. I'm an actor. But in preparation for my role on Rescue Me, where I play a post-9/11 New York City firefighter, I did a lot of research and investigation into the events surrounding September 11th. I was here in New York on September 11th. And no matter from which angle I approach the day and the events of the day, or the events leading up to the day of September 11th, it just devolves into contradictions, things that just don't make really any sense now that I'm looking back at the event with, I guess, fresh eyes, so to speak. So, you know, whether you're talking about circumvented protocols, blocked investigations, war games that were being run on September 11th, which made it impossible for the military to respond in time to the hijackings, whether you're talking about the questions surrounding what really hit the Pentagon, was it Flight 77, was it a missile, if it wasn't Flight 77, what happened to the people on Flight 77? I mean, there's so many unanswered questions, and I think that contextually what it points to, especially I think the most damning as evidence for me is, again, I'll bring it up, the thermitic residues found at Ground Zero. That's something that's really tough to explain away. And what it would suggest, I mean, did 19 guys with box cutters taking orders from a man hiding in a cave in Afghanistan really have access to the buildings to wire them to explode and to come down the way that they did? I mean, NIST has admitted now, under duress, but finally they have admitted that Building 7 experienced 105 feet of free fall speed, meaning you drop a tennis ball from the top of Building 7 and it would hit the ground at the same time that the roof of the structure would have hit the ground. There's only one way that that can happen. I mean, a building collapsing into the path of greatest resistance, into its own mass, but hitting the ground at the same time as a free-falling object, that means that there was mass moved out of the way. That means that the fall, something was accelerating that, something was helping that. The only way to do that is with bombs, and who put them there.
Do you think 9/11 was an inside job?
I think it was an inside job.
You do?
Look, in the aftermath of 9/11, we were told that we were attacked by Islamic radicalists who hated America because we were free, essentially. That was their basic explanation for what happened on the day. That, even on the day, didn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. However, in the course of my own investigations into 9/11, I came across a project for a New American Centuries document called Rebuilding America's Defenses, in which they lay out basically a plan for establishing, you know, American hegemony going into the next 3 or 4 decades. And they say at the end of the document that a new Pearl Harbor would advance and expedite that agenda. This is a year before 9/11. After 9/11, you have the unfolding of that very same agenda. 9/11 could arguably have been that new Pearl Harbor event which they invoked, which they themselves said would help them expedite their plans and their agenda. So this is an issue that should concern all Americans, because if 9/11 was indeed an inside job, it just puts things in an entirely new context.
On your show Rescue Me, you play a firefighter living his life post 9/11. Has there ever been a point where somebody on the job has asked you to possibly tone down your public opinion about September 11th?
Not with those words or those concerns. Nobody has ever come to me and, you know, kind of pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Daniel, you might want to tone it down. There could be maybe some blowback from this." And so far, I haven't experienced any appreciable blowback. The same commentator from Fox and Friends who called Charlie Sheen a Nazi and called him crazy also did the same to me when Rescue Me included 9/11 Truth as a subplot in this past season, due to, I think largely due to my lobbying the creators of the show on behalf of the subject matter and saying that this is the proper venue in which to address it. Greg Gutfield on Fox and Friends responded by calling me a Nazi, saying that I was insane. Again, not addressing any of the substantive points that I put forth through my character as Franco. So I don't know, at this point I'm not really as concerned about the backlash for speaking out as I am about the consequences of remaining silent.
Say hypothetically this referendum does get put on the mayoral ballot in November. How can an impartial investigation be created to look into September 11th without any politics playing a role?
Well, you know, the human element included in any kind of, you know, bureaucracy or bureaucratic process invariably muddies the waters. It probably wouldn't be a perfect process. I'm sure that it would be, you know, subject to some just criticism and would receive a lot of it from all sides, probably. You're never going to make everybody happy. But if we could just let's say, start with the goal of answering 40% or 50% or 55% of the questions of the people who lost loved ones on 9/11 and just make that our only focus, regardless, politics aside, that'd be a great place to start.
You've also said that while most questions surrounding 9/11 have not been answered, officials still send us off to kill and be killed in the name of freedom and democracy.
In their unending war of terror, while they send citizens of this country into foreign lands to advance a shamelessly transparent...
Now, these comments come to light as America is about to mark the 8th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan. Do you believe that's a war based on lies?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I feel that way. I mean, if you look at who benefited from 9/11, it certainly wasn't the 19 hijackers or, Osama bin Laden. Again, Project for a New American Century writes that document, they get their new Pearl Harbor, and then it's basically open season on the Middle East. And not only that, but you have simultaneously the drastic curtailing of civil liberties here on American soil with the passage of the Patriot Act and the Military Commissions Act and Homegrown Terrorism and Prevention Act, all of which contain lots of language which strips us of our civil rights. We no longer have habeas corpus. So 9/11 has served to basically solidify the grip of control of the American people here at home, and has opened the door to unending war around the world. At least that's what it has seemed to do. So it has benefited defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, people in the oil industry. These are the people who have benefited from 9/11.
You have repeatedly said that anybody who questions the government's version of September 11th is automatically considered a traitor, unpatriotic,
Crazy.
Yet you're still speaking out about this, and you have been speaking out about this issue and about the search for more answers. You're in the public eye. You're an actor. Are you concerned at all about the backlash that you may deal with?
Not really. I'd like to speak to that point that you just made, because mainstream media has pretty much been uniform in its response to celebrities in particular who have taken it upon themselves to speak out about this particular subject. You've got Willie Nelson, Marion Cotillard, Charlie Sheen, Rosie O'Donnell, Ed Asner, and the list goes on, Ed Begley Jr., famous people from the entertainment community who have spoken out about their questions regarding 9/11. Usually the mainstream media's response is to either completely ignore them or to literally call them crazy, call them insane, try to make loose associations between 9/11 Truth, which is a notoriously peaceful movement, although it is a movement of dissent, but a notoriously peaceful movement, to try to make loose connections between 9/11 Truth and terrorism, which Geraldo Rivera did when the Times Square bombing took place. He said, I don't think it was, I think it was probably one of those 9/11 was an inside job kind of guys, protesting kind of like the eco-terrorists, where they don't intend to inflict casualties. To make that kind of a loose association between 9/11 Truth and terrorism was incredibly irresponsible from a journalistic standpoint, and to do so without ever having really entertained the arguments being put forth by 9/11 truthers was intellectually disingenuous, to say the very least. I think it says a lot, and I will use Charlie Sheen as the most recent and probably best example. Charlie Sheen penned a letter to President Obama called 20 Minutes with the President, where he essentially asks for 20 minutes with President Obama to ask him questions on behalf of the victims' family members regarding 9/11, unanswered questions. And he has 20 bullet points in this letter to President Obama, and each one of these bullet points is supported in a bibliography that contains relatively uncontroversial news sources. And these are not like, the questions that he's asking are not crazy questions. It's not like holographic planes or beams from outer space having brought down the buildings. I mean, these are like really kind of nuts and bolts inconsistencies and contradictions that he wanted the president to address. Now, Geraldo Rivera came out and called him crazy. There's somebody on Fox and Friends whose name I can't remember, Gutfeld or something like that, who called him a Nazi. All kinds of ad hominem responses to a fact-based argument. And that, I think, is very telling. I think it means that somebody does not want to address the subject of 9/11 based upon the facts at hand. They want to respond with character assassination and personal insults. You know, on The View, which is not really the news, Meghan McCain responded to Charlie Sheen's 20 Minutes with the President initiative by saying, "Are you really going to take your political cues from an actor?" Clearly not remembering that Ronald Reagan was president of the United States and Arnold Schwarzenegger is governor of the state of California, so that's not really a very substantive rebuttal to the questions that Charlie has raised either. As a matter of fact, he has yet to be substantively addressed, you know, based upon what he has put forward, and I'm kind of not surprised.
In the last investigation, Bush and Cheney agreed to testify only behind closed doors, not under oath, and with no audio taping, no videotaping, nothing. Would you like to see them questioned again under oath?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I would. I mean, we've addressed a lot of kind of crimes of omission, things that by virtue of the fact that they didn't happen seem to say a lot, and I think that that's a great example of that. I mean, doesn't that smack of guilt or of evasion? I mean, look, just the fact that it took 441 days for them to launch what later became the 9/11 Commission, when under similar circumstances, after Pearl Harbor, after the Kennedy assassination, after other traumatic events that happened on American soil, commissions were kicked off almost immediately. Investigations were started almost immediately. 9/11, 441 days. And then when you finally get Bush and Cheney to sit down and answer a couple questions, they'll do it only under oath. And if they can have if they can sit next to their accomplice and make sure that they have their stories straight, I mean, it just doesn't look good. What are they hiding?
Yeah. How does it change? What do Americans have to do to cause a change? Because we have a president that's in the White House right now that campaigned on change and promised change.
I think what we have to do is we have to not sit back and assume that because Barack Obama got elected that things are necessarily going to change. I mean, we have to remember that there's a certain responsibility that comes with living in a democracy or in a country that aspires to the democratic ideal. Government by, of, and for the people, that insinuates that you must participate in your government, that you have to demand accountability, that you have to ask questions, that you have to participate in the governmental process. Now, I say that, but here we are talking about the NYC Can petition, where you have 80,000 people who are trying to do just that, and the state of New York seems to be blocking their attempts to participate in the process of governing themselves.